So, good afternoon, everybody. Hope you had a good lunch. So, on behalf of the FIRST community, let me welcome our next speaker to the session, who's a cybersecurity professional with over 15 years of experience on a mission to help organizations prepare and proactively respond to incidents. He's here to discuss how to use simple but yet effective cybersecurity exercises to measure existing processes and routines. Please welcome John Hollenberger.
Thank you very much. So it's great to be here with you. Thanks for joining me just after lunch. If you're going to nap, just don't snore too loud because you're going to affect the recording. That said, again, my name is John Hollenberger, Senior Security Consultant of Proactive Services. What does proactive mean? It means I get to help everyone while they're still happy. They're not being hacked at the moment when I'm helping them. So I am on the proactive team. Fortinet does have a reactive team as well, but I have the benefit of working with teams on incident response plans, tabletop exercises, a number of training courses. This is a little bit about me. As mentioned, I've been in the industry for almost 15 years, or a little over 15 years. Started off my career at the CERT Coordination Center with a number of people that are actually here today, and then worked my way through a number of organizations doing a number of things, including incident response, vulnerability assessments, PCI compliance, data loss prevention. If you've ever dealt with PCI compliance, I'm very sorry. That's why I got out of security for a while, was an IT director for a bit, for a nonprofit, before getting into consulting and doing tabletops and things like that now. Oh, important at the bottom there, if I can get it to go back, probably not. I'm also a volunteer firefighter. You will see throughout the presentation me comparing incident response to the fire department quite a bit, so that's just where that comes from. All right, so what are our goals today? By the end of the day, hopefully you'll have 3 simple cybersecurity exercises you can perform within your organization. They don't take a lot of time. You can set them up with as little as 10 to 15 minutes, get everyone in a room over lunch and run through the exercise. So that is my goal. Simple is good, if not better. You'll see that the scenarios that we have set up are very simple. They're not overly complex. There's not much to them. It doesn't take a lot of planning and preparation. So why perform exercises? Before we jump into the types, we're just going to go through a couple reasons why. To exercise our people and learn to work together. If you ever join a new team, there's that learning curve, understanding personalities, understanding our teammates, and also understanding our roles and responsibilities. So one thing that we can do is perform a cybersecurity exercise, such as a tabletop, to really understand our roles and responsibilities within the organization. So who's doing what? To look for gaps in the organization or vulnerabilities. During our exercises, we can look for these issues within our organization, whether they be in our people, our processes, or our technology. So our cybersecurity exercises can help find those issues within our organization. Regulatory requirements, legal requirements, depending on what you have to follow, you might have some regulatory requirements or some legal requirements to perform some sort of cybersecurity exercise. The board, everyone loves the board. They always want us to do things, make sure we're prepared for certain types of events or activities. So they might come to you and say, hey, are we prepared for this type of incident? So one way we can do that is practice the cybersecurity exercise. Practice our processes, policies, procedures, so our incident response plan. We can perform tabletop exercises or cybersecurity exercises really to practice with our incident response plans, processes, and procedures. And then last but not least, the financial impact. So looking at finances, I'm sure many of you have seen this chart or have read this report. This comes from Podimon and IBM Security. I do have permission to use this, just FYI, in case anyone wants to know. But on the far left there, you'll see that if you don't have an incident response team in place or incident response plan testing, that the average cost of a data breach was almost $5.92 million in 2022. The chart there does show the last 3 years, so the cost of incidents are getting greater and greater. Those groups with an incident response team and testing, that dropped down pretty significantly and has been pretty steady at 3.25, 3.3 million over the last 3 years. Frequency of tabletop exercises. So before I pull this one up, out of curiosity, show of hands, how many people have done a tabletop exercise before? All right, quite a bit. How many people do them every year? What about twice a year? Quarterly? 1, 2, 3, maybe 3 quarterly, 4, 5-ish. Not sure what that chart was. There we go. So this was a study done back in 2020. I know it was 2020, so can we trust it? Maybe, maybe not. It's kind of a shady year for most of us. But this was done by Osterman Research. Of the participants in this, roughly 29% were doing them annually, 21% every 6 months, 16% quarterly. So really what that shows is over half the participants were doing these at least every year, which is great. There were about 0.25% that had no set schedule, but they do them within the organization. One thing about that, if you're not doing them quarterly, I highly recommend trying to get into that quarterly rotation. The reason for that, the more you practice, the better you're going to get with responding to an incident, depending on the type. In the fire department, we train nearly every week. We've got members that will come, it's usually every Monday night. We'll get together, we'll practice a specific skill set within the organization. The more you practice, the better you're going to get. I like to use this example as a personal experience. I moved out of the district where I live for about 5 years and was really just doing the administration side of the fire department. So back end, paperwork, grants, things like that. So I wasn't doing the fire training. I wasn't responding to incidents. When I moved back in, I started responding again. I pretty much forgot everything that I had learned for the past 15 years. So I've been doing it for over 20 years. I recently got back into it, and it's like relearning how to ride a bike. The more you do your tabletop exercises, the more you practice with incident response, the better you're going to get, whether that's through a tabletop exercise, some hands-on skill, hands-on training. Make sure you do them quarterly if possible. Oops. Who ran the tabletop exercise? As you can see here, roughly 40% were doing it internally, which is great. That's something that you should try to achieve. If you can do these internally, you can do them more and more often. It is always good. I like to recommend, if you are on that quarterly schedule, have 1 external and then the other 3 internal. The reason to have an external, it's just an extra set of eyes, not necessarily because we have more expertise or anything like that. It's someone else looking at your processes, looking at how you're going to respond, giving you a write-up of what went well and what didn't go well. So we can look for areas for improvement for the organization, something that you may not have thought of, something extra to look at. Motivations, this is very similar to that slide a few slides back, but most importantly there is 41% were looking at, they were using it to look for vulnerabilities or issues to address within the organization. So the types of exercises, and these are going to range from simple to more complex, so it's going to take a little bit more time as we go through these. That's the first one there. Sorry about that. Do you guys know why to perform tabletops? Anyone? How often do you do them? All right, here we go. Maybe. No. So first is tabletop exercises. While they're pulling that back up, I'll just talk through it. So tabletop exercises, if you're not familiar, it looks like, I mean, based on the hands, most of you are familiar with tabletop exercises. It's really getting in a room, getting around a table, talking through some issue or some incident type. If you saw briefly there on the screen there, that's actually a tabletop we use for the fire department. It's essentially a mock city. It's out of our Allegheny County Fire Academy has that scenario built up for us, where we can actually walk through an incident type. So they could say that this building's on fire. We could talk about how we're going to respond, where the apparatus is going to go, what the placement is, who's going to do what when we get on scene, who's running the scenario. It's very similar for us with tabletop exercises. We're going to have a scenario. We're going to talk through what exactly is going on. We're going to have some inject, like the PowerPoint's not working. So we're going to talk through how we're going to fix the PowerPoint. And then we'll kind of talk through and figure out, like I said, who's going to do what there. And so say the first inject was that we have a phishing email that came into the environment. We're going to just talk through verbally through how to handle that. Next one there is a drill. A drill is really looking at a specific task or skill. So drill is very similar to training. So in this case, in that picture there, that's a forcible entry simulator where we look to essentially force entry into a door. It can be a swing in, swing out. So we're going to use that door to learn how to force entry into the building. Same with our drills in the cybersecurity space. It might be, say, collecting a disk image from a Windows machine. So what tool are we going to use for that? What's the best tool that we have in our organization to really collect that image? How are we going to go about that? How are we going to maintain that chain of custody? So we're talking really through a specific type of issue there. So a drill is typically going to be hands-on, looking at one specific type of activity. The last one is then a functional exercise. So a functional exercise you can think of as almost a full-scale response. You're going to maybe implant some fake malware into the environment, have the team go out and try and find that, find out what other systems it's on, and investigate what that malware was doing. In the fire department, we'll take a building like the one you see there. This was actually a training event that we had. So it wasn't an actual, I mean, it was an actual fire, but it wasn't an emergency. This is a building that we acquired. The township was getting rid of it. So we ended up setting various fires around and learning the fire behavior, learning the fire patterns, watching how that fire behaves and grows, and then putting the fire out and then rinse, wash, and repeat. Same with our cybersecurity exercises. We're really getting in, taking that Windows system, for example, running through from start to finish, getting the image, investigating the artifacts on there, and maybe doing it a little bit more full scale across the organization. So the first exercise there, social media compromise. So if you've never made a fake tweet, you can do that on the internet. It's a fun thing to do. I love taking and doing social media compromises. The reason I love social media compromises is because it doesn't really pertain to IT and security. More likely, they don't have access to the social media profile. They don't have access to any of the accounts. All they have to do is show up to the exercise. So we have this one here. We've got a tweet. So this First Bank of somewhere, looks like their Twitter account has been taken over, and the threat actor is threatening to encrypt their data. So who's the intended audience here? Usually some executives are going to be in the room. It's going to be a cross-functional group as well. So you're going to have communications or whoever manages the social media accounts. You're going to want them there. You're going to want to have IT in the room and probably information security there as well. So those are going to be your main points of contact. What if someone took over your social media account and then posted this? Is that going to change the scenario? We're going to have other people involved? Probably going to want physical security there. What if people start seeing this and coming to the location? So we're going to have some other teams involved. What would our goals be of a social media compromise? So first and foremost, understand the roles and responsibilities of the organization. So who's doing what? Obviously, if the account credentials got compromised, we definitely want our social media team or our marketing or communications team involved to talk through those account issues. So is it a shared account? Does everyone have individual accounts? Is there multi-factor authentication in place? So understanding what may have happened to those credentials and whose roles and responsibilities are there. Focus on internal and external communication requirements. So obviously, because this is public facing, we're going to have some internal and then also perhaps some external communications, or maybe we won't. So are we going to communicate or aren't we? So some things that we're going to have to decide. So some goals around internal and external communication. Understanding any external resources that we need to bring in. So do we need to bring in any external vendors here? Do we need to pull in our leads from, do we have contacts for Twitter or whatever social media account was compromised? A couple discussion points. Social media best practices. So do we have any standards, policies, procedures in place around social media accounts? Internal and external stakeholder communications, media relations, and law enforcement relations. So do we have relationship with media in place already? Do we have a team that we can work with for media communications? So do we have an external third party that we can work with to help with our external communications if necessary? Or do we have someone internally that has media communications training? And then what about law enforcement? So if it was that second tweet that went out, do we have someone in law enforcement that we can contact? Do we have to pull them in? And then alternate means for communication. How are we going to communicate externally if our social media accounts are compromised? Can we post it on our website? Are we worried about communicating? Do we have to go to a phone tree? What have you? So next up, we'll look at some variables that we can throw in here to make it a little bit more interesting. What if multiple channels were lost? It wasn't just Twitter. So now we have multiple accounts on multiple streams getting compromised. Does that indicate that we're using shared passwords, or is it a broader issue? Is the threat actor in our environment actually scraping passwords from somewhere else? What if the posts start going viral? What if national media gets involved at that point? Do we respond differently than if it was just local? What if regulatory authorities start reaching out to us? How does that change? How do we communicate with them? Do we need to pull in legal at this point? What if the postings release sensitive information? So what if we start having data leakage in place? What if it's our customer data? How does that affect our response? Does it affect our response? Does it affect who we need to have in the room? And then just the last one there, based on experience, usually takes 48 hours or more to regain control of compromised social media accounts, if you can even get in touch with them to get your account credentials back. So if it takes 48 hours or longer, what then? Does that change how we're going to respond? So all variables that you can throw in there to make that exercise a little bit different. Last one there, the attacker gains access to parts of the network also. So now not only do we have a social media compromise on our hand, we have a much larger issue where the threat actor actually is in our environment. So what then? All right, so we're flying through here. Next one here, lost laptop. So this one here, you can essentially make this, lost anywhere. In this case, I used TSA agent calling. So in the US, we have the TSA agents. So Drew P. Carmelo calls up and he says, hey, I found a laptop. The asset tag says to call this phone number. What would you like me to do with this? So who's our audience? Our hardware and asset management folks, whoever knows what's on that device and what that device is. Data loss prevention, perhaps. Information security. Marketing communications, again. Physical security. So all different groups that you can have involved there. Depending on what you're looking to get out of this, depending on your goals, you can either have it very focused on a technical exercise, or you can modify it to be more of an executive level or even cross-functional. So that's something you want to make sure you define ahead of time, as well as who your intended audience is. So something to think about. Not every exercise is going to have the same audience. So just make sure you have the right people in the room there. So our goals of this one, focus on data classification within the organization. So do we have data classification in place? Can we identify what was on that device that was lost or stolen? Ensure proper escalation of information and communication to the appropriate teams and individuals. This is a fun one. If you ever want to know whether or not people know if it's going to be communicated appropriately, one thing I'd recommend is calling the front desk saying, hey, I've got a lost or stolen laptop. I found, make up some scenario, and see how long it takes to get from the front desk to the security team or whoever that appropriate individual is. We've actually done that before in some of our exercises. We've called into the front desk because the team around the table was like, oh, they would know exactly what to do and who to call. It ended up taking over an hour into the exercise before it actually made its way to the security team. So it's a great way to test your organization, is just call in and see what happens. Obviously, again, similar to the last exercise, understand roles and responsibilities. So that's one that you'll see pretty often in exercises. It's making sure that folks know what their roles and responsibilities are. So some discussion points around this type of exercise. Release of sensitive information. So a lot of times when we go into organizations, what we find is that folks don't know what's on an individual's end user machine or what that person has access to. And it usually takes a while to figure out what exactly that person had access to and what may have been compromised. It's the same when you have an actual incident. We need to figure out what that threat actor may have had access to. So here, trying to determine what sensitive information may have been accessed. Disciplinary action, so you actually see it on the next slide. But what if this is a repeat offender? Is there any disciplinary action involved there? Do we need to get HR involved? Laptop retrieval. So say you're from New Zealand, your organization is from New Zealand and you're attending the first conference and you left your laptop at the first conference. How are you getting that laptop back? Is someone flying back over here to get that laptop? Or are you having them ship it back? Talking through that process there. What's the extent of the compromise? So how bad is it? In DLP technology, do we have anything in place to know if any sensitive data may have been compromised? And then regulatory requirements. What are the regulatory requirements? Do we have any reporting requirements? Do we have to notify anyone because this laptop was lost? Some of that may come into play with the variables, depending on who that person is. So some of the variables here, what if that laptop was logged on, was on and logged in? So, does that change things? If it's turned off and encrypted, you don't know the account, can't get into it. But if it was logged on and someone accessed that, does that change things here? What if that laptop belongs to a high-level executive or contains unreleased earnings information? Does that change the severity of this incident? Do we need to make other communications because it contains that unreleased earnings information? Do we need to stop trading at this point? What if that employee is a repeat offender? So they've lost their laptops multiple times, leave it places, had it stolen, what have you. Do we have to do anything about that employee for this or really any type of incident you can think of? What if that laptop was found by someone nefarious with some ill intent, not a TSA agent? So last one here is a hands-on drill. So this one's a little bit different. The first two, you're typically just going to be around the room talking. This one here, there's a little bit more hands-on, might take a little bit more time, but again, it's meant to be simple. So HR and legal schedule an unexpected meeting. We need an image of Michelle Murray's laptop immediately. They can't go into the details, but here's a signed legal document that says you have the permission to go and grab this image. Please know it may end up in court, so chain of custody is important. So who is our audience here? Obviously some technical resources. Who in the organization knows how to collect images? Do we have anyone in the staff that can do that? If the answer is no, then the exercise pretty much ends there because that's the point of the exercise. So that's something important to know there. Our incident response team, third-party forensics perhaps. Perhaps the goal is to test our third-party forensics team on how quickly they can respond. Legal, having legal involved there as well as HR. And then most likely our Chief Information Security Officer. What's unique about this is that you definitely want to keep things tight-lipped around a scenario like this. You want to keep that audience fairly small and not very broad. Obviously, when it comes to legal matters, it's more of a need to know. So keep that in mind. So our goals here, create a disk image of the internal drive as well as an external hard drive. Create a memory dump of that laptop, proper chain of custody followed, and then ensure the confidentiality of the communications throughout. Some discussion points. Again, do we have the skill set available to collect the evidence? Do we have the tools needed for imaging, or do we have to go out and get them? So how long is this process going to take? Chain of custody, obviously. Do we have somewhere where we can store that evidence? Do we have an evidence locker? Do we know where we could store it? Do we have the drives to store it on? Or do we have to go out and purchase drives, sanitize the drives, and then we can create our image? It's going to take a lot longer if we don't have the tools and processes in place ahead of time. So how long is it going to take to complete? And then if working with an external forensics provider, what does that process look like? How do we engage them? How long does it take for them to get engaged? Are they coming on site? Are they doing everything remote? If it's remote and we have a laptop that we need an image of, what's that look like? Do we have to ship the laptop out? Documentation and workflow. Do we have proper documentation in place? So just a few variables. Obviously, nobody within the organization has the experience with the tools. Unsure of how to properly maintain chain of custody. That's a big one. If you end up in court, you're going to need to make sure that you're maintaining chain of custody. The last thing you want is the lawyer to make you look silly up there in front of a court. Employee learns of the investigation, not from HR and legal. Does that change things? Now you have a disgruntled employee running around. Or perhaps the employee wiped his machine and hasn't been seen for days. Can we get anything off that system at that point? Do we have any other places we can go to look for evidence? Maybe we have to start looking at network traffic or logs in other places. So that changes the scenario completely, changes that incident up. So keys to success, keep it simple. None of these scenarios are overly complex. A one slide tabletop exercise, explaining what exactly is going on, working through that, and talking through that scenario. Don't overthink it. These don't need to be overly complex. I'll say this over and over. Anyone can do this. You don't need the technical know-how. You really just need to be comfortable in front of an audience, which I'm not, but here I am anyways. So just take the time and practice communicating, and you can run these exercises within your organization. Make sure you set clear goals. You want to make sure that those goals are set up ahead of time. Make sure the goals are going to define who the audience is for your exercise, so have those in place. And then, I can't stress this enough, practice often. If you can do tabletops quarterly, you're going to get a lot better at responding to incidents. So with that, there's my contact information on LinkedIn. It's probably legit. I haven't tested it in a while, might not be. You can find out. Any questions?
Yep.
So for the hands-on drill that you mentioned in scenario 3, you said one of the goals could be testing the third-party forensic vendors' capabilities, response times.
Yep.
Would you recommend getting their consent to pull them into a tabletop first, or to test them cold?
I would never test them cold.
Okay.
I would make sure at least someone on their side knows that it is a test. We've actually been through this before, where organizations have called and said they had an incident, and then we're testing the team's response. Being on that side of things, it's usually not fun, especially when they start not giving you logs or things that you asked for because there's not actually an incident going on. So usually working with the team, someone on their side to let them know. They may be okay with it. They may kind of, just depending on, it's something to work out ahead of time, more or less.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Any more questions? So maybe just a question for you from my side. What's your take on the recovery part of this if we take in looking at larger infrastructure incidents, for instance?
Yeah, so I mean, it's there's always going to be takeaways from your tabletops. If you're not, you may not have done something right. You should usually be. I always recommend having a scribe in the room, taking notes, looking at folks' response. You should usually have a post-action briefing after the exercise. Talk through what went well, but more importantly, what areas do we need to improve? And then mapping out those areas for improvement. Depending on what the issue is, mapping out to severity level. It may be some low-hanging fruit that you could check off really quickly, or there may be something that's more of a longer-term project. You know, perhaps you have an issue with password resets or password recovery in the organization that's going to be a more longer-term issue. You know, making sure you map that out and plan and prioritize that. One thing that you can do is if you find a gap within the organization during one tabletop, wait 6 months, and then do the same thing again, talk through it, see if it's been improved, and you can really look at whether or not things have been improved within the organization or not, and find out where that maturity level is and if it's gotten better.
Any?
Hi. I'm guessing like a point of the tabletop exercises is to come up with like a developed process after each one if the incident does occur. How much flexibility needs to be built into that process given each incident would differ slightly?
Can you kind of rephrase that question a bit? I'm not sure I fully understand.
Say after a tabletop exercise, you come up with a process to implement next time it happens, or if it happens for real. How much flexibility needs to be in that process in case, as each incident will be slightly different?
Sure, no, it's a good question. So if possible, I always recommend having a process guide around every incident type that the organization may have, which can be a lot. Your incident response plan really should cover kind of broader any incident, whereas your playbooks are going to cover specific incident types. As far as kind of depending on what your tabletop is, you're going to have some issues and areas to improve. That may be something that can be improved across the incident response lifecycle for any incident type, or it may be more specific to a specific type of incident. So it's you need to be kind of flexible in that nature, as in some cases it might be something that's going to fix a broad issue, whereas it could be a siloed, you know, say to ransomware.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation. The title says 3 simple and effective. I see they are simple, but in terms of effectiveness, how do you measure it, and why these are the most effective? Thank you.
So as far as effectiveness, it's measured against the goals that you set for the organization. So effective meaning in this case, you know, how well can the organization walk through an incident of this caliber or this type?
Is it based on the speed of recovery? So is it based on speed of recovery and how fast we can do things also?
It can be. I mean, it's really up to the organization. So every organization's goals are going to be different for their tabletop. In this case, some of them are going to take a bit longer than others. Social media account recovery might take a couple days. Lost and stolen laptop, if it's my laptop, there's nothing. I mean, you're not going to get much. You might get a couple tabletops out of me, but however, if it's someone higher up, the data is more sensitive. That might be a longer incident that's ongoing, so it could take a lot longer.
Maybe last question.
Considering in exercise 3 that guaranteeing the chain of custody is very difficult, so to what extent do you recommend delegating this part versus ramping up partially or totally internally?
Can you repeat the last part of that?
Ramping up in this type of skills to do a byte copy of a hard drive or something like this, and all the specific skills that are required here.
So, I mean, as far as chain of custody goes, you want to make sure you have a chain of custody form in place, make sure you have some storage location to do it. When you're collecting your disk image, a couple of things you're going to want to do is take hashes of that image, store those hashes with your image. Usually if I'm taking a disk image, I'm going to have, if it's a real incident, I'm going to have my regular disk image, and that's going to be my forensics copy that goes with my chain of custody form. And then I'm going to make a working copy of that and work off of that working copy of the evidence. So depending on what I'm doing, in this case here, I would definitely have that working copy for my legal team, but then have the forensics copy as well. And then maintaining the chain of custody form. That form, most countries are going to be very similar, but usually you're going to want to fill the form out. It's going to have information about who collected the evidence, information about what was collected. It's going to have sign off to and from. So if I collected it and I needed to pass that off to someone, signing that over to someone else. And then, or I could be signing it over to my storage locker. Hopefully that answered the question. I'm going to chat more too. I think we're close to out of time.
So thank you, John, for sharing, and thank you all for listening.
Yep. Thank you.